I used to work the register at a local gas station, though I've since left because there were a lot of strange things that happened when I would work overnight. This one situation in particular will stick with me forever. I only worked the night shift a few days a week, usually Friday and Saturday. My shifts were usually boring and honestly just a game of trying to stay awake. The only thing I really had to do was stock the shelves and occasionally help a customer. I would get a lot of drunk people, families on road trips, and sometimes even whole groups of friends, but for the most part it was pretty quiet. On this night, it was around 2 a.m., and I hadn't had a customer in over an hour, so I was starting to doze off a little bit. The desk was around the corner from the entrance, and there was a bell on the door that rang when somebody walked in, so usually falling asleep wasn't too big of a deal. I woke up after a few minutes, hearing the bell ring, and a few seconds later, I saw a customer walk in. He looked like a typical 30-year-old man who would come in for some beer or a snack. He walked around for a little bit down every aisle, looking at everything. Now, I've worked in retail for a long time, and I know what it looks like when someone is looking for something specific, but this man had nothing in mind. He was just looking at the shelves, browsing the store. During the day, this is pretty normal, but people don't usually come in at 2 a.m. to browse the gas station shelves. I looked out the window to my left to see if he was filling up his car and maybe just passing the time, but there were no cars outside. A couple of minutes went by before he eventually looked over at me and said, "Thanks," and then walked out. I didn't know what to make of that, but I just figured he stole something small and was just being a jerk about it. The whole situation left my mind after a few minutes, and I started to get really tired again. This time, I decided to grab my cart of items to stock and start filling up the shelves to pass the time. I'm not really sure how long I was stocking for, maybe 20 minutes, before I saw a man show up at the end of the aisle I was stocking. It made me jump a little as I never heard the door ring. This guy was wearing a large hoodie and dark clothes. I pretty much knew right away that something was very off. The man continued down to the back of the store, and I immediately went back behind the counter. I tried not to stare, but I noticed that as he walked down the aisles, he wasn't looking for anything. He was just browsing. It clicked in my head immediately that this was the same guy from just a little bit ago, but he had changed clothes for some reason. I also came to the realization that he probably came initially to scope out the place before doing whatever he planned on doing. I started to panic in my head. The man began to come down the aisle closest to the counter, and I could see something heavy in his front hoodie pocket. I made a split-second decision to try and prevent any further escalation. So I said, "Welcome back, sir. Need help finding anything?" He made eye contact with me, and I could tell he knew exactly what I was trying to do. He approached the counter without saying a word, brought his hand out of his pocket, revealing a small handgun. Then he grabbed a small pack of gum from beside the counter and placed it in front of me. He said just this, confused and in shock as to what was happening. I didn't even react for a few seconds before eventually scanning the gum nervously, still holding the gun. He took out $1 from his jean pocket and threw it on the counter, then said, "Thanks," and walked out. I was in total shock, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. I ended up reporting the situation to the police and calling my manager, who didn't pick up. No updates ever came out of the situation, but it had me on edge for the last few months that I worked there. I'm still unsure of what really happened that night or what the man's intentions were, but honestly, I'm glad I never found out. When I was 17, I worked at my mom and dad's local restaurant. We were never a busy place, but it was enough to get us by. I ran the cash register and occasionally helped out with waiting tables and cleaning. My parents were really nice about giving me flexible hours whenever I needed time for school or other activities. During the summer, though, I'd be working full 40-hour weeks, typically from the afternoon until closing. This was my second year working there, and during the last half of summer, my parents had me handle the closing tasks for most nights. I'd be there for maybe 15 to 30 minutes after restaurant hours to count the money and clean up. It wasn't difficult or anything, but it was just a tiny bit of extra responsibility. Anyway, on this Friday night, my dad and I had a somewhat busier night than usual. We were the only two workers there aside from the assistant cook. At closing, my dad helped me out for a few minutes, then locked up the front doors and left for the night. I had plans with a friend after work, so I was rushing to get everything done. When I finished, it was a few minutes past 11. I walked out the back door, which led to a small employee parking lot, but I was taken aback when I saw some guy right next to my car. He was looking through my windows like he was trying to see what was inside. "Hey, get away from my car," I shouted. He looked over at me, showing his face for a split second, then ran into the trees behind the parking lot. I didn't see him long enough to get a good look, but the only feature I could really make out was his long, unkempt, and patchy beard. He was a freaky-looking guy, and I was feeling really uneasy as I drove away. A couple of days passed, and on this night it was just me and the assistant cook working the closing shift. It was a weekday, so it was slow, but just 20 minutes before closing, a guy walked through the door and sat at a table without saying anything. Now, this was one of those restaurants where you go up to the register first to order, then sit down, so this was kind of weird. I waited for a few minutes until I walked up to his table and asked if he'd like to order anything before we closed. It was then that I saw his long, patchy beard and recognized him as the guy from the other night. I was so caught up in my thoughts that I didn't hear his response. I tried to tell him to leave, but I stuttered, and it came out with zero confidence and assertiveness. He looked me in the eyes and asked for a dark roast coffee, completely ignoring what I had said. I turned around and put the order in. I thought maybe this was all a misunderstanding somehow, but I'm pretty sure that was just me lying to myself to feel less scared of him. He sat at the table, staring ahead until his coffee was ready. I walked it over to him and reminded him that the place closed in 10 minutes, so he'd have to leave soon. Of course, he didn't respond, so I walked away. I went up to the assistant cook, who I never really talked to before, and told him about this guy and the uneasy feelings I got from him. He patted me on the shoulder and said to get started on cleaning. Then he went to the front. I watched from over the counter as he nicely told the guy to leave. The man got up and made brief eye contact with me from across the restaurant, then turned around and walked to the door. I watched him leave, and as he extended his arm to push the door open, a very easily recognizable object was revealed. A gun wedged in the back of his belt. I thanked the cook and told him everything in more detail so he understood my concerns. He called the police without even hesitating. While they didn't find the guy, he never came back to the restaurant. I'm grateful for our assistant cook, who I'm keeping anonymous for his own privacy. He could have easily just left for the night and let me deal with my own problems, but his kindness likely saved my life that night. I did deliveries for a popular fast food place in my town during the end of my high school years. My friends all had jobs there too, but they purposely scheduled us on separate shifts to prevent us from goofing off. It ruined all the fun, but the money was still nice to have. Mostly, I wouldn't have any interesting stories about my workdays, but this one night was an exception. It was the weekend, and I was working until 10 p.m. The orders were coming in steadily, so I was doing deliveries one after the other. I would go in, grab the bag, drive to the house, and repeat that process nonstop. I think it was around 9 when I got this particular order, but I can't say for sure because I was kind of mindlessly running the deliveries at this point. I grabbed the bag, pulled up the GPS location for the address, and started driving. Halfway through the drive, I realized this was taking me in a different direction than usual. I'd been this way before, but there weren't a lot of houses out here, so most orders would typically be in the other direction. I kept driving, not thinking too much of it, until I saw on the GPS that I was 1 minute away. Looking around, I didn't recognize any landmarks. There were just trees and the road, no houses, no shops, literally nothing. Regardless, I kept driving until the GPS said I'd arrived, which was just a quarter mile further down. I pulled off to the side and did a quick look around, just in case I was missing something, then decided to call the customer. The phone rang for a while before they finally picked up. "Hey, I drove to the address you put in, but it doesn't seem to be right. Can you please confirm the address?" I asked, hoping he just made a typo or something. He repeated the address back to me, but it was the same as the one I had in my GPS. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "Wait, I think I see you." I looked up ahead and, down the road, there was a person waving at me. I drove up next to him, but I had a bad feeling in my gut. I rolled the window down, and he immediately started apologizing, saying the address was tricky to find sometimes. He pointed behind him, saying his house was down that road. The road he was referring to looked more like a half-beaten dirt walking trail that went through the forest. I smiled and said it was all right, handing him the bag through the window. He smiled back and thanked me, watching me as I pulled back onto the road and did a U-turn. I looked in my rearview mirror at the man still standing on the side of the road, thinking about how strange that was. Not even a minute into the drive, something started to feel wrong. My car was bumpy and leaning to the right, and it was getting increasingly worse by the second. Started to feel dangerous to even drive, so I had to pull over. Before doing anything else, I called roadside assistance. I didn't know what was wrong yet or if it had anything to do with that man, but like I said, I had a bad feeling in my gut, and I wasn't taking any chances. After getting off the phone with them, I got out and looked at my tires. My front right tire was busted, and that was the tire closest to where the man had been standing. So I put 2 and 2 together pretty quickly. I looked back down the road where I had come from, and in the distance, I saw a figure walking toward me. I hurried into my car and locked the doors. He approached slowly, probably knowing the exact situation I was in. As the man got closer and closer, I contemplated whether or not to risk driving on my busted tire. But by some miracle, a truck came down the road and stopped behind me. The driver got out and asked if I was okay. I noticed the man from earlier quickly walking back the way he came. I took this opportunity to tell the truck driver about my suspicions, and he stayed there with me until the roadside assistance truck arrived, which was only a minute later. I got the police involved, and I wasn't surprised to find out that the name and address the man had ordered with were fake. I don't know what he was trying to do, but making me drive all the way out to an empty road hidden by the forest makes me think it would have been more than just a robbery. I'm a receptionist at a local hotel, and most of my shifts are overnight. I'm in charge of the front desk, and my main responsibilities are to check in guests, answer phone calls, and keep an eye on the security cameras. It's usually a pretty quiet job since our hotel isn't the biggest or busiest. One night, the hotel was mostly empty. There were only a few guests staying with us. I was sitting at the front desk on my phone when I saw a man start walking towards the doors outside. I stood up and greeted him when he came inside. He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes and said, "I need a room for the night." He was definitely high on something, but regardless, I checked him in and gave him a key to his room. It was standard to allow walk-in bookings when the hotel was less than 75% full. He started walking toward the elevators, and I sat back down, pulling my phone out. A few hours later, I was sitting at the front desk when I heard a noise coming from the hallway. It was a thumping sound, like someone trying to force a door open. I got up and walked around the corner to the end of the hallway. The man I had checked in earlier was standing there, trying to open one of our maintenance doors. "Can I help you find something?" I asked. He looked over at me with those creepy eyes. I asked again, but he just stared at me. I wasn't really sure what to think. Maybe he was really high and looking for the vending machine or something. I didn't want to anger the man, so I went back to my desk and tried to forget about it. A good amount of time passed with no activity. No sounds from any of the rooms, nobody entering the building or walking through the halls. It was around 3 in the morning, and I did a small walk around the bottom floor just to keep myself awake and busy. As I got to the hallway by the front desk, I heard a sudden, loud banging coming from one of the rooms. I stopped and listened for a moment, then went up the stairs to the second floor where I thought the sound came from. It was very quiet now, which made me somewhat nervous. I walked down the hall, hearing nothing, but when I reached the end, one of the room doors was open. I listened again for a second before lightly knocking. Nobody responded. I cautiously peeked inside, unsure of what to expect. It seemed empty. I wasn't comfortable walking all the way inside, so I couldn't really look around, but I was sure nobody was in there. I closed the door and checked the room number, 112. That was the room I had given to the man. I never saw him exit the building, though. Quickly, I walked back down to the front desk. I looked at all the security cameras we had in the lobby and outside the building, but the man didn't turn up. Suddenly, I jumped as the hotel phone rang. One of the rooms was calling. I picked it up. "Hello, how can I help you?" There was a woman on the line, telling me about some man knocking on her door in the middle of the night. I apologized and assured her I would take care of it. I hung up and took a deep breath. I was getting really nervous now. I walked around the desk, but then the phone started ringing again. It was someone else from a different room this time, saying they had the same experience as the other woman. Someone knocking at their door in the middle of the night. I called the police right away. I stood by the front doors until they arrived, just in case I needed a quick escape. Luckily, they came before anything happened, but they didn't find the man. Instead, they found a broken window in his room where he had likely jumped out. It was on the second story, though, so I'm not sure how he managed to get away without some major injuries. Later, while the police were still searching, they got a report that the car he used to pay for the room was stolen. It's unclear what the man intended to do or why he was knocking on people's doors. I'm thankful none of the guests opened their doors because this situation could have been much worse if they had. Working the night shift at the gas station had been my job for almost a year. It wasn't the best job, but it paid my bills. The hours were long, and the work was repetitive. I had thought many times about quitting and finding work somewhere else, but this one incident became my breaking point. It was a typical night at the gas station. I had just finished cleaning off the pumps and restocking the shelves when I saw the headlights of a car pulling into the lot. It was an old, beat-up car with tinted windows. As the car pulled up to the pump, I noticed there was only one person inside. He got out and started walking up to the door. The man looked to be in his mid-30s, with dark hair and a black leather jacket. He had the look of someone who hadn't slept in days. I greeted him with a smile and asked if he needed any help. He didn't say anything, just threw a $20 bill on the counter and went back out to fill up his tank. It was a bit rude, but that was normal for working at a gas station, especially late at night when nobody wants to talk. I watched through the window as he filled up his tank, but a couple of minutes passed, and he was still there with the pump in his car. I knew he had only put in $20, so he should have been done by then. I waited another couple of minutes before opening the door to ask if he needed any help. But instead of responding, he just got back in his car and drove away. I shrugged it off and went back inside the store. As the night wore on, I started to feel like something was off. I don't know how else to describe the feeling. Nobody else was pulling in to get gas, and it was eerily quiet outside. Then, I heard a noise coming from the back of the store. It sounded like a box falling off a shelf. Grabbing a flashlight, I slowly made my way to the back. When I turned the corner, there was a man standing there, rummaging through our inventory. He was tall and skinny, looking like he hadn't showered in weeks. I froze in fear, not sure what to do. The man turned and saw me. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and then he started walking toward me, his eyes locked on mine. I backed away slowly, raising my hands to show I meant no harm, but he kept coming closer. I could smell the alcohol on his breath and knew he was dangerous. "Money. Where is it?" he slurred, waving one hand that held a switchblade. He was clearly drunk and I was terrified. I pointed toward the register, and he pushed me back to the counter. As I was opening the till, the man wandered around the store, making his way to the liquor section. He stuffed a few expensive bottles into his backpack, then came back to the register. I put all the bills we had on the counter, barely over $100. The man looked at it, then glared at me. "The hell is this? I need more, man," he shouted, clearly unsatisfied. But there was no more money to give. He flipped open his blade, waving it around and yelling. I was sure he was going to jump the counter and attack me. But then, suddenly, he grabbed the cash and bolted out the door. My heart was pounding as I watched him run to the same beat-up car from earlier. He got inside and they sped off. The police arrived a few minutes later, responding to the emergency button I had pressed while the man was browsing the booze. Unfortunately, they weren't too helpful right away. Thankfully, the cameras outside the building were able to capture a license plate number from the car. For days later, I was informed that both men were caught. Apparently, they were homeless and had stolen the car. They then went on a crime spree, robbing as many stores as they could, mostly targeting alcohol and cash. I felt pretty lucky to have made it through unharmed, especially since their erratic behavior had sent one worker to the hospital after another encounter. A couple of weeks later, I quit my job and switched to working a day shift somewhere else. I just couldn't shake the unease of that night, and I decided it was time for a change. I've worked at a graveyard for the past 15 years, most of those years being the typical graveyard shift, which was from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. In my mind, working overnight had way more benefits than working during the day. During the day, workers had more to do since more people would be visiting the yard. There would also be burials taking place a few times a week that needed to be arranged. And above everything else, night shift paid an extra $2 an hour. I've seen a lot during my years working the night shift, though mostly it was teens messing around or the occasional drunk group of friends daring each other to walk through the yard. However, this night was different. I got to the small faculty building a bit early to chat with the day worker, and once he left, I did all of the normal checks and precautions at the beginning of my shift. Afterwards, my only job was really just to drive around in a golf cart every so often and make sure nothing was going on. I'd say I only encounter something once a month, or maybe even every other month. The first few hours were normal. I drove around several times, then went back to the small faculty building to eat my lunch. I think it was around 2 a.m. when I went back out to do another round of the yard. As I got to the far end, I saw something by the fence. It was obviously really dark, so I couldn't see much more than the general shape of a figure standing there. I drove up closer and could tell now that it was a man standing on the outside of the fence, looking toward me. I didn't want to confront him if I didn't have to, so I turned and drove in a small loop around the lot to see if he would try to hop the fence while I was gone. But when I got back after 30 seconds, he was gone. I scanned the area briefly to make sure he didn't sneak in, but it all looked clear, so I continued with my patrol. Going through the whole yard takes about 15 minutes, but sometimes I'd go slower just to pass the time. I went all the way around and decided to check back on the spot where I saw the man. I really didn't have anything better to do anyway. I started driving down there, and almost immediately, I spotted the man again. He was inside the yard, standing on the gravel path. I drove up closer again, but the man didn't move. I exited the golf cart and started walking up to him. He looked like a 40-year-old man. I stopped just a few feet away from him. "Sir, you can't be in here. I need to escort you out," I said, but he didn't even turn his head to look at me. After a second, a slight rush of fear went through me. "Sir, I need you to come with me," I repeated. I reached out my hand gently to tap his shoulder. As soon as I did, he whipped his head around to look at me. He just stared into my eyes, looking full of rage. I quickly took my hand away, and the man turned around and started walking away. I got back on my golf cart, preparing to call the police as I watched him go all the way down to the fence. He stepped over it and continued walking away. I was relieved but still terrified. I drove straight back to the faculty building and went inside. It was a small, single-room security-type building, but I felt a lot safer and calmer inside. I sat down and caught my breath. In all my years, I'd never really been scared because it was always just people messing around. But this was different. I waited inside for a while. I'm not sure how long, until I heard a bang on the door. I jumped out of my chair and stared at the door in fear. A few seconds later, they banged on the door again. These were aggressive knocks, not those of someone friendly. I had nowhere to go. I picked up the desk phone and called 911. I didn't know what they wanted or why they were here, but I wasn't going to risk it all to find out. After probably 3 minutes of them banging on the door, I heard them walk away. I still waited for the police to arrive before I opened the door. The following day, my manager was able to pull the CCTV security footage from the building. What I saw was horrifying. Just minutes after I entered the building, the man I'd seen in the yard earlier walked up to the door. He stood there silently for nearly 15 minutes before he banged on the door. He was also holding something in his hand, but the footage wasn't detailed enough to make out the object. It was likely a small pipe or bat of some sort. The man was never identified, but I still work the same job at the graveyard and haven't seen him since. I worked at a library in my mid-20s up until my early 30s. I worked overnight shifts there as a stocker and reorganizer. When I applied, I was told I'd be working mid-shifts, but a few months later, they decided to open a new overnight position. This place was huge and was an old stone building in the center of town, repurposed into a library. Being so large, though, stocking and reorganizing the books became too much for us employees to do consistently throughout the day. Nobody wanted to do the night shift, though, mainly because they only opened a single position, meaning whoever it was would be alone all night. I really didn't want to do it either, but they offered to increase the pay by $2 per hour for overnight shifts. That was a big deal for me at the time, so I took it. A few months in, everything was going well. Even though I was technically doing the same job as when I worked mid-shifts, it felt completely different. I didn't have to interact with customers, waste time helping them, or anything. I just did my work, listened to music, and nobody bothered me. Over the following months, though, I strangely started to become less and less comfortable while working. It was weird because I figured I should be getting more comfortable as time went on. But I began thinking about how old the building was, and it kind of creeped me out. Sometimes, I'd look up from the bookshelf and see the empty, dark room with what felt like hundreds of aisles where anything could be hiding. I'd pull my headphones out and listen, hearing nothing but silence, which for some reason made me feel even more creeped out. But then, one night, when I was doing my usual listening to music and stalking, I heard something from the other side of the large room. I stopped moving for a moment as I registered in my head that I did actually hear something. Then I pulled out my headphones and looked up. I kind of just stood there for a few minutes, scared to move. I was waiting for something else to happen, but nothing ever did. So I went back to my work, this time leaving my headphones out. I finished rearranging the shelf, then I rolled my cart to the back to grab all the book returns. But that's when I heard it again. This time, with my headphones away, I could confirm it was inside the building, and I could tell it was the sound of something falling on the ground. It might have sounded just like a small book hitting the floor, but in such a large, quiet room, it echoed loudly. Again, I froze and just stared in the direction I heard the sound coming from. Considering the building was full of books, it didn't seem unlikely for a couple of books to fall down randomly. But that didn't really make me feel any more comfortable. Something felt off, like I was being watched. My head started doing that thing again, going through every reason to be scared of the place, and I was trying really hard not to panic. I knew the likelihood of it just being a book falling off the shelf was high, and I also knew that I'd often get into my head and scare myself for no reason. So I got myself to walk over and check. I walked slowly through the aisles of bookshelves, looking down each one. I got to the very last aisle. There was nothing, not a book or anything down any of the aisles. The panic started to come up in my head again. I turned around, and my heart stopped. Someone was standing by the door leading to the back storage room. They were in the far corner, as if trying to hide against the wall, but I could tell they were watching me. I resisted every urge in my body to scream and run. I looked away, walked back down the aisles, unlocked the front door, and walked out. As soon as the door closed behind me, I sprinted around the back of the building to my car and locked myself inside, then called the police. I was shaking and crying when they arrived. I came to the front of the building and waited while two of them searched inside, but they came out alone. Apparently, they didn't find anyone. My mind immediately thought of how I should have locked the front door after I got out, but I was so afraid I didn't even think about it. My manager had us do a stock count and everything in the following days, but nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. No large amounts of stock missing. It made everyone question why the person was in the building or if there even was a person at all. It really sucked because a lot of my coworkers thought that it was just some weird trick to get me out of working night shifts. I know what I heard, though. There was no mistake. And I know what I saw, too. Despite that horrifying night, I still kept my job. They were nice enough to let me do mid-shifts for a month before going back to nights. After that, though, nothing else ever happened. I'm just left with the mystery of what that man was trying to do. I work as a cybersecurity analyst for a large office company in my town. I had just started my first job in the field, so of course, I had to work the shift that nobody else wanted to. Working overnight wasn't as terrible as I thought, though it was actually pretty peaceful. My job mainly consisted of looking through log files to make sure nothing sketchy happened while the rest of the crew was sleeping. This meant that I was always pretty much alone in the office building for several hours. I'd fall asleep pretty often, as staring at a screen for hours on end in the middle of the night was hard on my eyes. With nobody there to keep me company, staying awake wasn't very easy. I started setting soft alarms on my phone to go off every hour just to make sure that I didn't sleep through my entire shift. I had been working this job for about 4 months when this happened, and I actually still work there now. It was a regular night, and my coworker had just finished his shift at 12 o'clock and left the building. A couple of minutes later, I got up, started the coffee machine, and then walked down the main hallway to do a general check for anyone still in the building. This was my regular routine. Just to make myself more comfortable, I sat back down at my desk, took my phone out to turn on the alarms, and then continued on with my work. It was about 20 minutes later when I realized I had never heard the coffee machine beep to signal that it was done. I went to check on it. I walked down the hall to the small coffee desk and saw that there was no coffee in the pot. Then I saw that the entire coffee machine was turned off. I thought it was weird, but that was about it. I just turned it back on and went back to my desk. As soon as I sat down, I noticed my phone wasn't where I had left it on the desk. I patted down my pockets and ran back to the coffee desk, but it wasn't there either. I played it back in my memory and knew for sure that I had placed it right on my desk, next to my keyboard. I started to get really freaked out and looked around frantically. The way my desk was set up, it was right in the middle of a large room with other desks and computers. I felt like I was being watched as I stood there in the middle, knowing that someone else had to be in there with me. Nervously, I called out in a shaky voice to my friend, really hoping that it was just him playing some dumb prank on me. I waited for a few seconds, but there was no reply. As I stood by my desk, another few seconds went by before I heard a soft shuffling coming from behind the desk in the far corner. Almost immediately after, my phone alarm rang from the opposite corner of the room. My first thought was that there were probably two unknown strangers in the room with me, and I instantly started running for the door to get out of the building. I didn't hear any footsteps behind me as I made it out, but I didn't take any chances. I ran across the street to a neighboring gas station and called 911 with their phone to report the unknown people in our office building. The police arrived quicker than I thought and searched the building. They brought out a man after only a few minutes, though I didn't recognize him at all. They also retrieved my phone, which they found behind some boxes in the corner of the office. The man was also found with a small knife in his pocket. The next day, we got a lot more information about what really took place. Apparently, the man was an old employee who had been fired recently, before I started working there. The man told the police that he was trying to scare me in order to get me to leave the building so that he could take back his company laptop. Apparently, he had information that he wanted from it. At least those were his claims. It all seems really weird to me, and I'm not sure if I even trusted his reasoning for breaking in, but my coworkers did say they remembered the guy, and he was definitely a little bit strange. I'm glad I got out of there when I did, though, because I'm not sure what would have happened if his plan didn't work and I chose to stay in the building. I worked at a small local diner for a year back in 2019. It was just a regular, ordinary restaurant, and I was a server there. The place closed at 10 p.m. every night, but my shift actually ended at 11 because I had to clean all the tables in the back room before heading home. It was a normal night of closing alone, and I had just locked the doors at 10 p.m. I began wiping down the tables, but after just a couple of seconds, several loud knocks came from the front door. It made me jump, but I looked over and saw a man standing there, looking through the glass door. I spoke loudly, telling him the place was closed for the night. This had happened before, so it wasn't much of a big deal, but the guy stayed there for a little bit, as if he didn't understand what I said. I walked closer to the door. Sorry, the store closed. That's it. We aren't taking any more orders tonight. I spoke even louder this time, so I knew he heard me. The guy looked at me for a second with no reaction before making a slight smile and turning around as he walked away. I thought he might have been drunk or something, but I forgot about it after a couple of minutes and continued with my work. I finished cleaning all the tables and started wiping down the front counter when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure moving towards the front door, followed by knocking again. It was the same guy from 15 minutes ago, standing right outside, looking through the door at me. I'd never had someone do this before, so I was more annoyed this time. I raised both of my arms up in a "what are you doing" kind of gesture. The man, still staring at me, knocked again. I told him with a very loud and strict voice that we were closed and he needed to leave. This time, though, he looked very bothered by what I had said. He tensed up, then gave the door a small push as if to test if it was locked or not before walking away. "What the hell is wrong with that guy?" I said out loud to myself as I walked toward the front windows to make sure he was leaving the area. I didn't see him anywhere in the parking lot, so I figured he was gone for good. I checked the time and was slightly annoyed, as it was later than I was hoping, but just as I began walking over to the counter, a sudden loud bang came from the restaurant's back door. I froze in fear as I wasn't confident whether or not the back door was locked, but a couple of seconds later, he began hitting the door over and over. Knowing now that the door was locked, I knew I needed to leave while I still had the chance. I sprinted out the front door, got to my car, and called the police as fast as I could. After a minute or two, I could see through the restaurant window as the man appeared and began looking through the whole building. Then he tried to open the cash register, but I think he gave up after a few tries and then disappeared to the back of the store. Once the police arrived, they made sure the man was gone and then got the whole story from me. The back door had huge dents in it, and the door handle was almost completely gone, clearly having been beaten by a hammer or something. But other than that, there wasn't much damage or anything stolen, aside from the tip jar we kept at the front counter. I just find it crazy that some people are willing to do these sorts of things just for a couple of extra bucks. Who knows what he would have done if I had stood in his way. I spent most of my 20s working at a variety of stores as a stocker, basically just putting products on shelves all day. After a few years, though, I took a job at a common pet store that required me to work at multiple locations. I'd basically get a small van full of boxes every day, and I'd drive to all the stores in the area, filling their shelves. Then, I'd drop the van off at the warehouse when I finished. The thing about this job, though, was that I'd pick up the van at 2 p.m., so I wouldn't get out until midnight. But most nights, it would take much longer, and I'd have to do 1 to 2 hours of overtime. This wasn't too big of a deal for me because with the overtime, I was making really good money. But the shift did make it hard to have a normal life. Anyway, I had been doing it for several months already, and it was just like every other shift. It was 11 p.m., and I was heading to the last store, which meant I probably wouldn't get back to the warehouse until 1 a.m. Obviously, the pet stores closed at 9 p.m., so I'd always be the only one there. There was a small dock in the back where I could pull my van next to and then take my dolly out to roll the boxes in. I pulled up as usual, unlocked the door to the building, and rolled in 3 large stacks of boxes. I began moving each box to the aisle that the product belonged to when I heard a small thud from the front of the store. I looked up and stood there quietly for a few seconds, then went back to work. After there were no more noises, I did get creeped out sometimes when working in the stores alone at night, but I'd gotten used to it by this point. When the buildings are quiet, you can hear sounds you normally don't, like the air conditioning turning on and off, so I figured the noise was just another random sound the building made. I finished unloading the boxes into the aisles and began opening them to stock the products. I was probably halfway done and about 45 minutes in when I heard the distinct sound of a single cough echo through the building. I froze, staring at the front of the store again. I could feel my heart instantly start racing as I was absolutely terrified. Nobody was supposed to be here, and I knew that if they didn't have bad intentions, they would have said something when I came in. After waiting for almost a minute, I slowly and quietly started stepping towards the back door. Once I made it outside, I shut the door and locked it, feeling much safer now. I got into my van and pulled my phone out to call 911. Just as I did that, I heard footsteps rushing towards the door from the inside, followed by the door handle moving slightly. The door was key-locked, so I knew they wouldn't be able to open it, but it was still terrifying and made my adrenaline start pumping. Then, loud, harsh banging, and possibly even kicking, came from the other side of the door. The man started yelling, pleading with me to let him out. I could hear the anger and rage in his voice. I didn't respond and hurried to call the police. As I was on the phone, the man was swearing and cursing repeatedly, hitting the door, and aggressively trying to get it open. Once the operator said the police were on their way, I turned the van on and moved further down, away from the door. I know I should have been safe and just driven far away, but part of me wanted to make sure that this guy didn't escape before the police arrived. Thankfully, they got there pretty quickly. I met them at the door, which was now quiet, and gave them the key. The 3 officers went in, and a couple of minutes later, they came out with a man in handcuffs. He was found with a pretty big knife on him, but nothing else. I think that's the weirdest part of this whole situation, and the thing that I think about the most. The man was hiding in a store with a knife and didn't steal anything. I'd never seen the man before, so I don't know why he'd want to harm me, but it seems like that might be the only explanation. It's scary to think that I could have been just a few feet away from something horrible, but at least now I don't have to worry about what his true intentions were. For almost 3 years, I worked overnight at a fast food restaurant as the drive-thru attendant. My college class schedule was unusual and only part-time, so working overnight actually made my life a lot easier, allowing me to get schoolwork done during the day. For the most part, my shifts would go by slowly and would be very uneventful. However, sometimes strange things would happen. My manager always did his best to make sure 2 people were scheduled overnight, but every once in a while we'd have to be alone for the night. Thankfully, most of the weird things would happen with my coworker there with me, but with this one incident I wasn't so lucky. My main coworker that worked overnights with me was taking his vacation week, so that left me alone 3 out of the 5 night shifts that I worked that week. My first 2 nights went as usual with no problems. It was slow, and all the drive-thru customers' orders were small and simple. On the 3rd night, it started out slow as well, with only 5 to 10 customers coming every hour, ordering a small snack or a drink. Then, around 2 a.m., there was a long break of nobody showing up for almost 45 minutes. I kept my headset on in case someone pulled into the drive-thru, but decided to start cleaning while I had extra time. There wasn't really anything else to do, so cleaning was my way of passing the time. I'm not really sure how long I was cleaning for, as I was never interrupted, but I passed by the front counter at one point and noticed bright headlights shining through the front window of the store. The car was parked right outside the doors. Our restaurant's dining room closed at 9 p.m. every night, and only the drive-thru stayed open, so it was a little weird that someone was parked there. But, of course, I didn't really think too much of it, as they could have just parked to pull up directions on their iPhone or something. So I continued with my cleaning. A few minutes later, though, my headset beeped, signaling that a customer was in the drive-thru lane. I quickly made my way to the window and asked how I could help them. A man spoke softly, asking for a large soda. I told him to pull forward and began pouring his fountain drink as usual. The guy pulled up really quickly, though, so I was still pouring the drink, but I could see, out of the corner of my eye, that he was looking in the window at the restaurant. People did this, but I never understood why, because it makes it really awkward. I finished up and handed him the drink. He gave me the exact change, and I thanked him, telling him to have a good night. As I stepped away and went back to cleaning, I wiped down a few counters and reorganized a small shelf. But as I passed by the window, I jumped back a little as the man was still there, staring at me. "Did you need something else, sir?" I asked. He didn't respond for a moment, not even reacting to my question, before he finally said no and drove away. The guy must have been sitting there looking in the window for a whole 5 minutes while I was cleaning, which was really creepy and weird, but I knew the doors to the restaurant were locked, so I still felt somewhat safe. Again, I kept my headset on and went over to the front counters to wipe them down. A few more minutes went by before there was a beep in the headset again. But when I got to the computer and asked what they wanted, nobody answered. I asked again and still got no response. So, I turned around and looked at the cameras behind me that showed live footage of the drive-through line. Strangely, the car passed the ordering station and was stopped several feet behind the window I was standing at. I looked closer and could recognize the car as the man from just a few minutes ago. At this point, I was starting to get pretty nervous, so I backed away from the window and stood around the corner. The way I was positioned, I was out of sight from the window, but I could still see the footage from the camera. I couldn't tell what the guy in the car was doing, but I could see movement in the grainy video. A minute later, he pulled the car up quickly and started banging on the window aggressively. I was startled, but after a few moments, he sped his car out of the drive-through lane and parked right in front of the front door. The driver's door swung open, and the man got out holding something in his hand as he quickly approached the front door. I immediately grabbed the store phone and called 911 as the man aggressively shook the handles, trying to force the locked doors open. Thankfully, he gave up after a few tries and ran back to his car, driving away. The police made sure I was okay when they arrived, and I told them what had happened. From what I heard, they came back in the morning to speak with my manager and collect the camera footage so that they could get a license plate. I was never updated on the situation after that, though, so I'm not really sure if he was caught. I've always assumed the man was attempting a robbery, but there's no way to know for sure. Being alone that night made me an easy target, though, and a lot of horrible things could have happened with no one there to help me. It was just past 11 p.m., and I was in the back room of our building, moving boxes around. It was just a regular hardware store, and I was an overnight stalker there. My other coworker, whom I usually worked with, was on vacation, so it was just me for the night. I didn't mind, though, because people always expect less from you when you're left alone to do all the work. So if anything didn't get done, it wouldn't really matter. I was working slowly, taking my time. All the deliveries that came in during the day needed to be put in the aisles where they belonged, so I was just breaking down the pallets and putting boxes on carts that I would then roll into the main shopping area to stock. Once I had filled a few carts, I grabbed one and pushed it to the aisle on the far left. It was raining, or maybe even storming, pretty heavily outside. Though through the rain, I thought I heard something from the front of the building. I didn't really care, not even crossing my mind for a second that it was anything other than the building making noises. I took a few boxes and started stocking, humming to myself to save me from the boredom. But then again, I thought I heard something. I walked down to the front of the store and looked all the way at the other end, where the front door was. There didn't seem to be anything or anyone. I stayed there for a little bit, again in no rush to work, and then it happened again. I could have sworn this time that I saw something moving by the front door, and that was where the sounds seemed to come from. Being in my place of work, with all the doors locked, I wasn't really afraid of anything, but more just wanted to make sure nothing strange was going on outside. I went up to the front door and looked out the glass, which I noticed had huge smudges and scratches on it. Nothing was outside. No cars or people, just heavy rain pouring down. I turned and started walking away, back to where I was working. It was quiet for a while, maybe a whole hour even, but then the sound came again from the front door. I dropped what I was doing immediately and walked back to the front, and from across the store, I could for sure make out a figure moving around outside the door. I began walking closer before the figure stopped, stood still for a second, and then ran away. I ran up to the door, trying to catch a glimpse of the person, but it was too dark and rainy. Looking at the door, though, there were definitely more marks on it than there were before. I was confident that this person was trying to break in. I pulled out my phone, still standing by the door, and called the police. The operator said it wouldn't be too long, just a few minutes. I put my phone back in my pocket and waited by the door, looking around. The parking lot was still empty, but then I turned my head to look against the building, and on the very side was that same figure. I backed away quickly, worried that he may have seen me. I took several steps back and tried to be quiet. Not even 10 seconds later, the figure appeared right outside the door. While the glass was somewhat foggy and had raindrops all over it, I could tell he was looking at me. He slammed something against the window. It looked like maybe a large rock. Then he hit it again and again, trying to break the glass. I backed away quicker and ran to the back of the store, locking myself in the office. Through the building, I heard the glass shatter and the alarm by the door go off. I waited in fear, hearing nothing else. A few minutes of silence passed, and I was growing more and more nervous until the police finally showed up. I heard them call out and walk around searching the place before they got to the office, where I identified myself and told them what I knew. The guy wasn't in the store, so I guess after he broke the glass, he just left. Seems really weird and doesn't make any sense. Part of me even wishes that he had actually stolen something so that I'd at least know that that was what he was after. But given he didn't do anything after breaking down the door, I don't know what he wanted. And that is what still scares me to this day. I used to be a bus driver for the local suburban kindergarten and elementary schools. After nearly 15 years, I retired from that job and started driving buses in the city where I lived. I loved my job driving kids around, but as I got older, it became more difficult for me to put on a smiling face every day and interact with energetic and chaotic children. Driving in the city, the bus lot was only a 10-minute walk from my apartment, and the passengers would mostly just get in and out. While the actual driving part of the job was more stressful, I still felt a sense of relief compared to before. The city bus company I worked for had buses running 24/7, though at night they only had a few buses out, and they would just run longer routes. Few drivers actually wanted these shifts, so all of us day drivers were forced to do 2 night shifts every other week. It wasn't horrible, aside from it messing up my sleep schedule. There were fewer passengers and the roads were more empty, so the job was much more relaxing than it was during the day. It was somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m. this night, and nobody was out. I drove my normal route several times over the course of an hour, and not a single person needed a ride. I maybe only saw 4 or 5 people total, even walking outside. I pulled up to the last stop of the route and parked, not to pick anyone up, but just to take a quick break while it wasn't busy. I leaned my head on the back of the seat and closed my eyes to rest them. I was being sure not to fall asleep, but soon enough, I heard a noise at the door. My eyes shot open as I was startled by the sudden sound. An older man was standing at the door, looking at me. I made a nervous and awkward smile, then opened the door. He stepped in, scanned his bus pass, then went to the very back of the bus and sat down. "Nobody else is out, so I can drop you off wherever you need," I yelled, turning my head slightly towards the back. There was a really awkward few seconds before I turned back forward and started on the road again. I thought he might have had earbuds in or something, so I was just going to do it the hard way and stop at every bus stop along the route like I was supposed to. Over the course of the drive, I constantly checked the mirror, seeing the man just sitting in the back, staring ahead. It was odd behavior, but who knows what these people have on their minds at 3 a.m. I pulled up to every stop on the route and was approaching the last 2, wondering when this man was going to get off. After these, it just loops back around to where I picked him up. When I stopped at the next spot, I put the bus in park and looked at the man in the mirror. After a second, he got up. He began walking down the aisle, but the way he was staring at the floor was really unusual. As he got closer, I turned my body around and could see his face. It was full of anger and rage. I tried to act normal, turning my face to the road again, but the guy stopped right next to me. I looked over, and he was staring down at me. "Is everything okay?" I asked. The man continued staring, but then he looked away and walked back down the aisle to sit down. This was the point where I knew something was very wrong, and I started to worry. After a moment, I put the bus back in drive and headed to the next and final stop. When we arrived, I put it in park and waited. There was a sort of tension in this moment that was hard to describe. I looked ahead at the empty roads and sidewalks. Then, the man got up and walked quickly down the aisle. He approached me, but this time he shoved me against the side window and held a gun against my head. Looking him in the eyes, he had that same look as before, crazed anger and rage. I didn't know why or what he wanted from me, but I was sure he was going to pull that trigger. The man didn't say anything. He just tensed up and pushed the gun against my head even harder, still staring me in the eyes. Then, he opened his mouth wide and screamed right in my face. A painfully loud, angry scream. Afterward, he let go, backed up, and walked out. I quickly closed the door and drove away. I called the police as soon as possible, knowing that his bus pass would have his identity in the system. An officer was sent to where I dropped the man off, while another came to where I was to get more information. A couple of days later, they showed me a picture of the man who was on the bus pass that the stranger had used, but it was a completely different person. I don't know what kind of sick mind that man had or what he wanted from me, but that was the most unusual, disturbing, and creepy encounter I've ever had and will probably ever have.